Welcome to Thrive with Pride by AgeOptions, an inclusive online space for LGBT+ older adults and those who care for them. This is a recording of a live event held on Zoom, which included a Q&A segment that was not recorded. This month, we welcomed Michael Herndon and Lisa Schifferle from Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to lead us in a discussion on reframing scam shame. Please see the video description below for a PDF of their slides presented and other helpful resources.
Let's face it, we've all made money mistakes, and this month is National Financial Capability Month, so this is a time for encouraging people to take action to improve their financial futures. Today we've got Michael Herndon and Lisa Schifferle from CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for a conversation that reframes getting scammed into a story of recovery and resilience. So I'll read these bios out here, starting with Lisa Schifferle, Senior Policy Analyst in the CFPB's Office for Older Americans. She leads the Managing Someone Else's Money Financial Caregiver Program, as well as the Money Smart for Older Adults Scam Awareness Program. She also supports the office's work to combat elder financial exploitation through network collaboration and age-friendly banking. Ms. Schifferle's career in consumer protection spans more than 25 years. Before coming to CFPB, she worked at the Federal Trade Commission, where she trained consumers, business, and advocates on scams, identity theft, and cybersecurity. She also served as the FTC's identity theft coordinator and litigated fraud and data security cases. Prior to FTC, Ms. Schifferle worked at the Maryland Legal Aid Bureau as a staff attorney and supervising attorney. She represented low-income clients in consumer bankruptcy, housing, public benefits, and employment cases. Ms. Schifferle received her BA, summa cum laude, from Yale College and her JD from University of Virginia School of Law. And her partner in crime today is going to be Michael Herndon. Joined the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in January of 2017 as Deputy Assistant Director of the Director of the Office for Older Americans. He has nearly 30 years of experience in personal finance issues, consumer outreach, and public policy. Prior to CFPB, he worked at AARP on 2 different occasions, with his most recent role being the Vice President of Financial Resilience Programs. His experience also includes serving as Consumer Outreach Officer for the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the Director of Public Affairs for the Certified Financial Planner Board of Standards, and as Manager of Government Relations for the International Association for Financial Planning. Mr. Herndon earned a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from the University of Tennessee and a Master of Public Administration from Georgia State University, where he received the Dan Sweat Scholarship for Academic Excellence. So I will go ahead now and turn it over to our presenters. Michael, I believe you're kicking us off.
Yes, thank you so much, Nina, for including us in today's event. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar today about reframing scam shame. I'm Michael Herndon, the Deputy Assistant Director for the Office for Older Americans at CFPB, and then obviously Lisa will be presenting with me today. We're going to share with you some trends about scams and resources and tips on avoiding them. And both for individuals and how these resources can be used, sort of leveraged for the wider community. And we're doing this today sort of in the context of reframing scam shame with the knowledge that scams are crimes. They are not just a mistake, they are a crime that is perpetrated by someone against someone else. Many of the perpetrators are very sophisticated criminals, sometimes in large-scale operations. In fact, I've just learned recently that there are sort of scam compounds in Southeast Asian countries where people are just cranking out scam calls, and so it's really sophisticated and large scale. So we don't want to blame somebody for falling victim to such a sophisticated operation. And I liken it to saying we wouldn't blame somebody if their car is stolen. The first response is not, well, you should have not parked it there. You should have had better security. Didn't you have a tracking location? The thing should be, it's, hey, this was a crime that occurred to you by sometimes a sophisticated operation. So scams and crimes like these can happen to anyone, regardless of their age, race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status or education or a variety of levels. These are, again, crimes that are perpetrated against people, and they can happen to anyone, and we should allow them to be able to recover and have a sense of resilience about it. So next slide, please. If you ever see a federal government presentation or from representative of the federal government, we usually have to make these disclaimers. So I'll just sort of read it here. The presentation is being made by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau representatives on behalf of the Bureau. It does not constitute legal interpretation, guidance, or advice of the CFPB. Any opinions or views stated today by the presenters are our own and may not represent the Bureau's views. So next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with CFPB, I understand the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We're a financial regulator of the federal government, and we regulate several consumer financial products and services. And then we also have a charge of educating and empowering consumers to make better informed financial decisions. My office and Lisa's office that we work in is the Office for Older Americans. And we are charged with, in the law, to specifically work for adults who are 62 and older, as well as working with the financial caregivers who may be supporting someone who's that age or older, or people who are getting close to that age. We don't qualify, and test people before we help them or work with them or provide resources, but that's the general target audience. And we work to help protect these older adults from financial harms that can happen to them, and then also to make better decisions as they age. So that website there can certainly show you a lot of more information about our office. That's our landing page for our office. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Schifferle, who's going to talk about the trends and tips, and then I'll be back on later to talk about some of our resources that are available. So Lisa.
Thanks so much, Michael. And thanks again to Thrive with Pride for inviting us to speak with you today. As Michael said, this is a really important topic in terms of making sure that people do not feel ashamed or embarrassed to report scams and fraud, because they are crimes. And we're going to share today some trends so you can just see how widespread they are, and some tips to try to avoid scams and exploitation. So let's start on the next slide with some big picture trends. And you'll see here that the Federal Trade Commission, which is the main federal government agency that keeps track of fraud and scam statistics, they report 5.4 million reports of fraud in 2023 for $10 billion in fraud loss. So that's a slight increase from 2022, and basically scams skyrocketed during the pandemic, and they have continued to rise since then. You'll also see here that the top three categories are identity theft, imposters, and then credit bureau related issues. The interesting thing at the bottom of the slide is this shows how many people who experience a scam actually lose money to it. And the good news is that only 27% of people, that's still a huge proportion, which is why it's important to talk about fraud and scams, but not all of these people who are reporting scams are actually losing money to them. 27% are reporting a loss, and that's what results in the $10 billion in loss in 2023. And the median loss is about $500, and we'll talk later about how that varies by age. In fact, you'll see on this next slide some trends related to age. And a lot of people may have this sort of stereotype of an older, vulnerable victim. But what the statistics actually show is that younger people are more likely to report losing money to fraud than older people. So again, older people shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed. Nobody should be, but we know that oftentimes older people are particularly afraid to report scams because they're worried that maybe people will think, oh, this is a sign of cognitive decline. Whereas if the same thing happened to a 30-year-old, nobody would say that. So it's important to note that younger people are actually losing money to fraud more often than older people, according to FTC reports. The other interesting thing, though, is that when older people do experience a loss, their loss is much higher. You'll see on the right-hand side of the slide, it's over $1,400 for people over the age of 80 as compared to $480 for people in their 20s. On the next slide, you'll see a similar, this basically portrays similar information as what I was just saying, but just in a different way. The yellow line shows the percentage of people with a fraud loss. So as it goes down to the right, you see it's going down over age. As you get older, people are less likely to be reporting losing money to the scams. They're still reporting the scams, but they aren't losing money as often. But the blue line you'll see shows how much money they're losing. So you see it goes way up in the 70s and 80s that older people are losing larger amounts of money when they do lose money. So let's look at what are the top fraud categories reported to the FTC. And this is based on the number of reports as opposed to fraud loss. The big things right now are imposter scams, online shopping, and lottery scams. And we're going to talk about some of these big scams as well as investment scams in a little bit. But first, let me talk a little bit more about the trends we're seeing, because it's important to look at things like the payment methods used to pay scammers, because by understanding the tools that the scammers are using, we can better recognize and avoid them. So on the next slide, you'll see payment methods. And we're going to talk about this more when we talk about a recovery report, which talks about what are the factors that influence whether people get their money back if they do lose it to a scam. And one of the big factors there is payment methods. So what you see on this slide here is that these are the payment methods that scammers use. So the most prevalent are credit cards and debit cards, as you see on the left-hand side. But on the right-hand side, that represents the money loss. So you'll see that people lose money the most when they're paying by bank transfer or by cryptocurrency. So those are big red flags too. If you are experiencing something or know someone who's experiencing something that you think, oh, maybe this is a scam, I'm not sure. If they're asking you to pay by cryptocurrency, that can be a big red flag. Now on the next slide, you'll see some interesting trends. These have changed in the past few years in terms of how do scammers contact you. It used to be all about phone calls. Now emails beating out phone calls is the most prevalent way that scammers are contacting people. Phone calls are still big. You see email, phone call, and text are the top 3 ways scammers contact you. But in terms of how people are losing money to scams, the big ways, and this is where you look at that lighter line there, are if you're contacted through a website, social media, or online or pop-up ad, that's where the big financial losses are. So again, those are things to be aware of. Now on the next line, next slide here, this talks, that's good. Yeah, thank you. This talks about losses by age and by fraud type. So we talked earlier about how older adults actually are less likely to report a fraud loss than younger people. Younger people are reporting losing money more. This one looks at what are the types of scams that are more likely to affect older people versus younger people. So here the blue thicker line represents older people and the gray thinner line represents younger people. So you can see that while all ages report online shopping and business imposter issues, younger people are reporting far more losses due to online shopping scams. On that first one, you see how that gray line representing younger people goes out a lot farther. So that's something where disproportionately younger people are reporting online shopping scams and also investment scams. You see how the gray line sticks out a lot further than the blue line. Those are ones that are affecting younger people more. But if you look at, say, tech support scams, the third one down there, you'll see how the blue line extends a lot further. Same with prizes, sweepstakes, and lotteries. So those are ones that are disproportionately affecting older people. This is just interesting because understanding these trends can give us a window into what's happening in our communities and what you may need to look for when you're looking for scams. Now on the next slide, we'll see a little bit more about top scams for older adults by dollar loss. So even though if you compare to younger people are seeing the investment scams more than older people. This still shows that older people are losing a lot of money to investment scams, business imposters, and romance scams. So we're going to talk about those in a few minutes now that we've gone through the trends. But what we do know, and the reason we talk about a lot of these trends at the national level, is the better you're able to recognize a scam, the less likely you are to lose money to them. So that can help you recognize a scam that might be affecting you or somebody you know. We do have a couple slides just to take a closer look at Illinois and what's going on there. This is from the FTC's Consumer Sentinel data. And you'll see on this slide that Illinois, like the rest of the country, has a lot of identity theft, credit bureau issues, and imposter scams, and online shopping issues. It does seem to have a higher proportion of reports about banks and lenders and more auto-related and debt collection reports than some other parts of the country. And on the next slide, you'll see some CFPB data about Illinois. And this also just gives you a wider perspective about what's going on in the state. And just so you know the difference between the FTC and the CFPB complaints, the FTC takes a lot of the scam-related complaints, which is why a lot of this scam data is focused on FTC Consumer Sentinel data. At the CFPB, we take complaints related to lenders and credit reporting, banks and lenders. So we're not taking complaints about things like imposter scams. If we are, we're referring them to FTC. But this kind of rounds out the picture of what's going on with financial lives of people, especially older adults. And these are focused on older adults in Illinois. And what we see here are top complaints include credit reporting, mortgages, checking or savings accounts, credit card, and debt collection. So you can see that older adults are facing a variety of issues when it comes to fraud, scams, and financial exploitation. And now that we've laid out the trends, I'm going to talk a little bit about tips to recognize and avoid some of the more common scams that we're seeing against older adults. So since imposter scams are on the list near the top of the biggest complaints, and it covers so many different types of scams, it covers romance scams, it covers grandparent scams, lottery scams, government imposters. So we're going to focus our discussion today on a lot of different imposter scams with a special look at these 4 scams: tech support, online dating, mortgage closing scams, and investment scams. Now, online dating is one of the highest dollar losses for older adults, and tech support scams is one of the most prevalent one of affecting older adults. So let's start with online dating scams. These are often also called romance scams or sweetheart scams. And these happen when someone meets another person online. It can be through a dating app or maybe through a social media platform. And they start what seems to be a relationship, but then they often start asking for money. They may say there's an emergency like a car accident or a medical procedure, or maybe they say they need money to travel to see you. They take a lot of time to build up this relationship. And as Michael said, these are often sophisticated crime rings, not real individuals. There will be crime rings that'll take one photo and spread it all across the internet and unfortunately develop fake relationships with multiple people using this picture of this attractive person who's usually overseas and unable to meet you in person. So another big red flag here is often these people, these scammers and criminals, want you to pay them in cryptocurrency or prepaid card or gift card, because they know that once you're paid, you pay them that way, it's almost impossible for you to get the money back. And these can be really hard scams to deal with. If you know anyone who's been involved with them, they pull on your heartstrings. So people can withdraw large sums of money to wire it overseas. So if you know someone who's doing that and that's out of character, do try to talk to them. Oftentimes the way that these scams are stopped is because a friend or loved one recognizes them rather than the person and tips them off. So a lot of things that we tell people to recognize these scams and to avoid them is don't send money or give access to your accounts to someone who you have not met in person. That may seem pretty simple to some people, but many people do end up sending money to people they haven't met in person, because now we're used to doing so much online that you feel like you know somebody sometimes if you've seen them, especially if you've seen them on a video chat or something like that. So don't give any money if you haven't met them in person, because it could very well be a scam. And also to limit what personal information people share online. On the next line, you'll see some of the top lies that these criminals use in order to try to convince you about a romance scam. They may say that someone's sick or hurt or in jail. Another big trend right now is they say they're going to teach you how to invest. They say, look, I'm rich. I want to marry you. I'm going to teach you to be rich too, especially by investing in cryptocurrency. And since many people do not fully understand how cryptocurrency works, this is a way that they then trick people into thinking they're learning how to invest in cryptocurrency, but in fact, they're sending their money to the scammer and the criminal. So sometimes they also say they're in the military or overseas or in an oil rig, and that's why they can't meet you in person. They might talk about marriage before even meeting in person. And there are some other examples on this slide, but I do want to highlight also that while this can happen and does happen to anyone, in the past few years, we have heard about some online dating scams that have targeted LGBT dating platforms in particular. And the FTC did a blog on this if you want to learn more. But what happens in these scams is they have an extortion angle, and a scammer will pose as a romantic partner, sending explicit photos and then asking you to do the same. And then if you send the photos, they start blackmailing you, saying they're going to threaten to share the photos with family, friends, and employers unless you pay. And some of the scammers threaten people who are not fully out as LGBT to pay up or to be outed. And that's an element of this unfortunate crime. So what the FBI advises in all types of extortion online is do not pay. Do not pay for ransomware. Do not pay to try to release or hold information. Instead, contact them at ic3.gov. That's Internet Crimes Complaint Center. ic3.gov is a way to report these scams and to hopefully get the FBI involved to try to shut down the scam and make sure that no information is sent out. So on the next slide, you'll see one of our fraud prevention placemats. This one is on romance scams, and you can find them at consumerfinance.gov/order. You can order any of the publications that we'll talk about today for free. These were originally designed as placemats to go under meals with meal delivery programs like Meals on Wheels to let people know about different frauds and scams. But they're also great resources if you work in the community or just if you live in the community and want to share knowledge about scams and how to prevent them. You can buy these as handouts and bookmarks and other formats, both in English and in Spanish. And they're a great way to help prevent online dating scams. And we have them on a variety of other scams as well. So let's turn now to tech support scams. While romance scams are ones that end up often with big financial losses in tens of thousands of dollars, these tech support scams, they may be lower dollar, like $500 or so, but they happen to tons of people and very sophisticated, highly educated people. Often, I know people at the FTC who said they got these and didn't realize they were scams and paid money to the scammer before realizing that it was in fact a scam. So what happens here is you may get a phone call or you may get a pop-up on your computer saying that you have a virus and that they need to remote into your computer or to remove a virus, or sometimes they'll just say, call tech support at this 800 number, or they'll give an unsolicited email with a link to click on. What happens is they either remote into your computer and then they can put malware on there in order to steal information on your computer. Or they tell you you have viruses when you don't really have viruses, and then they make you pay for an expensive tech support contract saying, you know, if you pay me $300, I'll help you get these viruses off your computer. And then they'll often say, okay, go get some Apple gift cards and read me the numbers off the back. And sometimes they'll even convince people by, you know, helping them out and waiting and telling them where they can go get the gift cards and waiting on the phone with them while they do it. So in this scam, some of the tips that we provide in order to help people not lose money to these tech support scams is not to give control of your computer to someone who calls you out of the blue, and not to click on links and pop-ups or emails. Oftentimes, if you just shut off and turn back on your computer, it'll that little pop-up will disappear and you'll realize that it was a scam. And if you had clicked on that link, then it might have downloaded malware onto your computer. Also good as a preventative measure, just to keep the legitimate antivirus software up to date in order to help guard against those scams. Also, then if you get a pop-up, you won't be as worried that it's real because you'll know that you've already updated your antivirus. You can even set it to auto update, which can be helpful as well. And on the next slide, you'll see another one of our fraud prevention placemats. This one's on online safety, and it goes over some of the basic tips we're discussing, like locking your devices, using strong passwords, at least 12 characters with uppercase, lowercase, and special characters. You know, longer is stronger when it comes to passwords. It also encourages people to limit personal information they share online and know the red flags of scams, many of the things we're going over today. So the next scam I want to highlight are investment scams. These are another big dollar loss for people across all age groups. And how do these investment scams work? Well, scammers may ask you to put all your money into what they say is a no risk or high yield investment, or they take your money and say, don't worry, I'll take care of it. You don't need to do anything more. Sometimes they're even someone you know from your neighborhood, community, or faith group, so that they play on that trust and take advantage of that trust. Or you may learn about a supposed financial advisor through a phishing scam, through an email or other communication. So the next slide shows some red flags to look out for and some safeguards. So if someone is pressuring you to act quickly before it's too late, that's a big red flag for all sorts of scams, but especially investment scams. Also, if they say they're guaranteed or no risk, there's no risk investment. If they tell you to leave it all to them and don't worry about it, that's a red flag that they're just trying to take your money and do as they please and don't want you to pay attention to what they're doing. If they won't if they won't explain their payment structure, maybe that means there's something in it for them more than they're letting on. And also, if they ask you to put all your money in one investment, if you think of the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket, that holds true here. Now, the thing about investment scams is there are some really great tips to know about, such as that you can check the background of a broker or brokerage firm or investment advisor at FINRA.org, and also at investor.gov. The Securities and Exchange Commission has a place where you can check out information about investments before you do invest. You should also, take your time, do your research, and interview the broker advisor and ask them about how you can file complaints and how you can get paid. But really, the big things that a lot of people don't know about is that FINRA.org and investor.gov are two ways you can check out about investments before you do invest. Now, the last scam I want to highlight today is our mortgage closing scams. And these can happen to older adults, maybe if you're downsizing to move to a smaller house, or if you're just refinancing to age in place. And what happens here is that scammers are increasingly taking advantage of these home buyers during the closing process. And it's basically a phishing scheme where they pretend to be your real estate broker and they try to divert your closing costs and down payment into a fraudulent account. They tell you you're getting last minute changes to your wiring instructions and make it look like the email is coming from your agent or settlement attorney. So these schemes are really complex, and they often appear as legitimate conversations from the real estate agent or settlement agent. So again, people should not be ashamed or embarrassed. These are very complex, sophisticated scams. But unfortunately, with this one, since a home is one of the biggest purchases that most of us will ever make, the ultimate cost for many people is their life savings, or a good chunk of their money. So these are really good ones to know about and to keep an eye out for. And some of the red flags are on the next slide here. The big thing to know is if anyone calls or emails with last minute changes to your wiring instructions, be very suspicious and call back your agent and your settlement attorney at numbers you know to be correct, not at anything on that email or message with the last minute instructions. Call them back at what numbers you know are correct to verify anything before sending any money. We also have some safeguards in terms of planning ahead. The CFPB has a mortgage closing checklist that walks you through some things to do before you go to closing on any sort of mortgage for your home, whether it's a new home or a refinance. And it's also good to discuss any wire transfer things, protocols or other issues to at least two people, the realtor and the settlement agent, so that you can make sure to verify anything before sending such a large chunk of money. So what do you do if this does happen to you? Again, it's important not to be ashamed or embarrassed about this or any other kind of scam, and to go ahead and report it as quickly as possible. If you contact your bank or wire transfer company immediately as soon as you realize that this may have been a scam, ask for a wire recall. Reporting the error as soon as possible can increase the likelihood you'll be able to recover your money. So it is important not to let the shame or embarrassment to keep you from reporting, because if you wait 3 or 4 days and then tell someone you think it might be a scam, it may be harder to get your money back. But you can also file a complaint with the FBI, again, at ic3.gov. But again, it's important with all of these not to be ashamed or embarrassed and to report them. You can report them at reportfraud.ftc.gov. You can report them to ic3.gov. And you can also report them to the financial institution or whatever place that you sent the money, so that you can try to get your money back. And so speaking of trying to get your money back, now that we've talked about a variety of different scams and how to recognize them and try to avoid them, I want to talk about a subject that's far less discussed, which is how to recover from scams and elder financial exploitation, and what are the factors that affect whether someone gets their money back. So on the next slide, you'll see a copy of our report that we issued in September 2022. And this has findings which look at the question about what are the factors that affect when someone gets their money back. You can find this full report at consumerfinance.gov/EFE-report. But I'll give you some highlights right now just so you get a sense of it. So on the next slide, you'll see what we call the financial recovery framework. Our report was based on interviews with consumers and practitioners who lost money to scams or exploitation. And we looked at what are the factors that affected whether they got their money back or not. Based on our interviews, we noted 4 different stages to the recovery process, each of which has factors that can affect whether someone recovers their money or not. The first phase is identifying that the fraud happened. Like, we looked at what factors affect whether people actually recognize that a crime has occurred. The second is reporting. What affects whether people then report it? The third is investigation. What affects whether the case gets investigated? And the final is return of funds and different factors that affect whether people actually get their money back. So let's look at each of those stages in turn, starting with identification. As I mentioned earlier, the payment method for the transaction can be a big factor in terms of whether you get your money back. We found that if people paid by credit card, then they're far more likely to recover. Sometimes a credit card company identifies the fraud themselves. Probably all of us have gotten a call from a credit card company at some point in our lives saying, oh, we noticed a suspicious transaction on your account. And if we're lucky that they've stopped it before it's actually the money's gone out. Another thing that affects whether people identify it can be their personal financial situation, whether they have a lot of money or not. And they may affect whether they're more likely to notice a smaller dollar loss. Also, whether the older adult knew the perpetrator. If it's a stranger scam, then they may be more likely to recognize it than if it's a family member or loved one who's exploiting them. Finally, the victim's health, including their physical health and cognitive decline, might affect whether they are able to identify elder financial exploitation. Now, if somebody does identify it, the next big key thing is they have to report it. They're not going to get their money back if they identify it but stop there and do nothing. So we then looked at the factors that affect whether people report fraud and financial exploitation. Again, there are financial factors like the method and amount of transaction. If it's a credit card, people are more likely to report because the company may even highlight it for them and tell them about it. Another big factor is, again, whether the victim knows the perpetrator. If they do, they might be less likely to report because they sometimes don't want the person they know affected. And oftentimes, sadly, with elder financial exploitation, it can be a loved one who is fueling a drug or alcohol or other addiction, gambling addiction, by taking money from the older person. And sometimes the older person may not want that person to be adversely affected by reporting it. But that is another factor that went on into it. We also found that, much like the topic we're talking about today in terms of shame and guilt, that a lot of older adults were ashamed or embarrassed or blamed themselves for what happened, so they didn't report. One of the older adults we talked to about an investment scam said, oh, that's on me. I just made a bad investment. But no, it's not on you. It was actually a criminal that stole your money. So it's really important to remember with all these types of scams, even though, personal responsibility is something to be lauded, that these are scams or crimes, and people shouldn't be ashamed or embarrassed and shouldn't blame themselves for what happened, because that can also lead to not reporting. And if you don't report, then you're not likely to get your money back. Other factors are faith in the authorities. That can play a big role in terms of whether people report. And especially we heard from some LGBTQ people who we talked to and people of color who we talked to who had prior negative experiences with local police or local law enforcement, and so did not want to get the police involved in this elder financial exploitation issue either, because they didn't think they would get a favorable response. So that's another factor that played into whether people reported or not. So those are some of the factors that affect reporting. So you can see why it's very hard for people to recover. First, they have to identify it. Then they have to be willing to report it. And then third comes investigation. Once it's reported, how do we make sure these cases are investigated? And there are many of the same cross-cutting factors that we saw in the first two phases, like the method and amount of transaction may affect it, the person's financial situation, the relationship with the perpetrator, and also embarrassment can affect whether people are willing to go on with the investigation stage. But a couple of factors that I want to point out that are unique to the investigation stage are the complexity of the investigation may affect whether it gets investigated. If it's really complex, especially if they're overseas defendants, like many of these romance scams I mentioned, there are overseas criminal rings. And like Michael said, oftentimes there are complete phone banks in other countries set up to target people. That was true with the IRS imposter scam. So it may not get investigated, but it does get investigated. So sometimes, so people should still report. For example, with the IRS imposter scams, the Department of Justice, FTC, Treasury Inspector General went in and shut down a bunch of these scam call centers overseas. And then the amount of IRS imposters went way down. The scam calls went way down after these call centers were shut down. So that's why it is important to report and to seek investigation, even if there are overseas defendants. The last stage is return of the funds. So even if we get to stage 4 and you've gotten it investigated, you've gone to court, there still are some factors that affect whether people get their money back. For example, prosecutors noted that even when the court orders repayment, sometimes there may be a repayment plan with very small amounts monthly over the period of years based on the perpetrator's ability to repay. So for some older adults, waiting years for repayment can mean even that they might pass away before a substantial portion of the money is repaid. So you can see from this that recovery can be difficult, but that's all the more reason that it's important to recognize and prevent scams before they happen, and also why it's important to not be ashamed or embarrassed and report the scams, because the more people that report, the more recovery there can be. And by looking at these factors, we can figure out what are the pressure points so that more people can recover if they lose money to a scam. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Michael to talk about some of the free tools from the CFPB that can help you with scam awareness in your community. And then we will be back at the end to answer questions.
Thank you, Lisa. Just going to share some resources that CFPB has produced. They can help you individually or community-wide if you want to share these resources beyond just yourself. So next slide, you'll see that I think kind of one of our leading offerings is the Money Smart for older adults. It's a joint thing that we produce with the FDIC. It has both a resource guide, which is the consumer-facing piece, which is designed for someone who's trying to learn about this topic and understand fraud avoidance and money topics, and then an instructor guide, which is designed for someone who wants to provide the curriculum in their own community so they could sort of teach a class, so to speak. They're available for bulk order, so you could order multiple copies at once, the resource guide, and then they're also available for downloads. You could download the instructor guide and then a number of the resource guides to conduct a lesson. It has a lot of information about more than just what we covered today on the types of scams and fraud avoidance tips and that kind of information. And they're available in English and Spanish. So on the next slide, we also have some guides that sort of more one sheet kind of, double-sided print materials that help people make informed decisions. Like I said, we have plenty of topics covered, more than just what's here. It's on reverse mortgages, choosing a financial advisor, pension lump sum payouts, all those kinds of information that you might need. All of these different guides have what I think is very important, which is where to go for help. So it's a little bit of information, and then also if you need additional help, resources on what official government or other entities to speak to. On the next slide, if you know someone who experiences a scam or want to communicate to people who might have experienced a scam, as we've been saying, reporting it is really important. Please have it report them to the FTC. There's a very clear website and place to report. If they experience identity theft, there's a bit more steps to take on how to recover from that. And the FTC has information for both instances of you've lost money to a scam or identity theft. So those two websites there can provide information to those individuals. And on the next slide, the final thing is just about, as Lisa said, submitting a complaint to us. It's not fraud so much as it is somebody who has a problem with the company. So if they're struggling with a credit report issue or a checking account issue, that kind of thing, this slide, this page here that we're showing is where that person would submit a complaint. We help consumers with financial companies to understand the issues and fix errors and get a response from that company. So if a consumer has a problem with a financial product or service like a credit card, like I said, and they've already reached out to the company, they can submit a complaint to the CFPB, tell us about that issue, we'll forward it to the company, and then expect a response back from that company. And generally that occurs within about 15 days. So the next slide just goes to the final bit of information, which is the website, again, for our landing page, the email address for our office. One thing I also point out is on that landing page, you'll see a place where you can sign up to our newsletter. Newsletter, it's email distribution. So we send out emails periodically, and you could sign up to be on that list. So whether it's a new report that we've put out or a new consumer information or whatever we're sending out to our email subscribers, individuals can get it on that consumerfinance.gov/oldamericans on the right side of the page. And there's Lisa's email address. Please feel free to email me as well. It's the same sort of format, michael.herndon, HERNDON, @cfpb.gov. And that is our information today.
Thanks again to Lisa and Michael for joining us this month. Don't forget to check out the video description below for slides from their presentation and other resources discussed during Q&A. Sign up for email reminders of future events at www.thrivingwithpride.org. Thanks for watching.